Everyone's seen a cove. It's a concave curve you can cut on the table saw. But what about the opposite? A convex curve. I wanted to see if I could make one with a router. This video is the result of about a month of experimenting to make this happen. Let's make things. I have pretty much everything I'm gonna need right here. The pivot is a 1/2-inch galvanized pipe. That's gonna act as the rotational axis for the board. For the sled and structure, I'm using 3/4-inch plywood. I'll cut a track into it so I can run one of this metal bar down the center so that the top and bottom can ride with each other. And it'll just basically keep everything lined up. I've used the same kind of method with the tenoning jig. And again, you can see that they just slide right back and forth with each other. Like the tenoning jig, we're gonna use a piece of T-track. I'll also have a knob that will slide on it that will lock everything down. The pipe is gonna sit in a pair of cradle blocks, which is just basically a thick piece of stock with notches cut out of it. And I'll use a couple brass bolts as a friction brake so the pipe can't rotate while I'm making a cut. This is all basic, easy to find material, no specialty hardware or anything weird. I'll have a full list of what I used up on the website. But the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna build a sled base. The bar is 3/8 of an inch, so we need to set our blade at 3/16 of an inch. It really needs to be exactly 3/16 of an inch. I'll set my miter bar to 17 3/4 of an inch. I'm gonna make a cut, flip it, and make another cut. And it is important that your stock is flat. Now I'm gonna move this over just slightly, about 1/16 of an inch, and I'm gonna do the same thing again, and we'll keep doing this pattern until the metal bar fits inside of the groove. And that fits in there perfectly. We want it to be nice and tight and just barely touching the bottom. Now we're not quite done making channels yet. We need to add our T-track down the middle. So I'm going to raise the blade so the tooth is just right at the level of my T-track. Now I'll set this to 12 inches, which is the middle. And I'm gonna do the same thing until my T-track fits in the middle channel. And that's fitting perfectly. Now I'll set this to 6 inches. I've already kind of made a mistake here. I should have cut this in half before I added the center channel. It really doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt anything the way that I've done it here. But you might section this off and then add your channel to just the larger piece. Now I need to cut my rod to length. And this is 6 inches, but I'm going to go a little bit less. I'm going to go 5.5 inches. I'm going to draw a line on the back side of each one of these. I want to make sure that I get that entire line cleaned off. This will give the epoxy something to hold on to later on. You can see I just kind of rounded this just a little bit. I've got a 50-50 of vinegar and water, and I'm going to spray that on that back side because I want to get any kind of oil or residue off. With the epoxy mixed, I can run it straight down the center and add my first bar. I'll make sure that I've got that 1/2 inch from the front. We'll add some F-clamps and wait for it to cure. With the epoxy cured, I can go ahead and set this on top, and I should be able to slide it without any problems. And we know that it's gonna be lined up perfectly because of the way that we made the cuts and these bars. So the next thing that we need to do is add our T-track. But before I cut this down and do anything else, I want to take my first piece and flip it over. About a 1/2 inch away, I'm going to use a brad point bit and just mark that center. And now I know obviously where I'm going to be able to drill that hole for this to be able to clamp down to the bottom one. And I need my T-bolt to be about 1 3/8. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this one off here. If you thread a net on beforehand, it makes it easy to come back and clean up the threading at the end so that it's easy to put a nut back on. And I'll need another Bittner nut, so I'll take this off. Once again, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch outer diameter nut with a 1/4 inch inside diameter. Just like that. We'll drill the mark that we made earlier with a 1/4 inch drill bit. We can put it together, just like that. The next part that we're going to work on are the pivot blocks. There's 4 in all. 2 that will actually be attached to the base, and 2 that will be attached to the bar. Just like my steel rod, I want to raise my blade so that this is the thickness of my pipe. And this is really important, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to check it by making a cut. So if I check this, it's about 107, 1/28, and I'm just a little shy, so I'll raise it a little bit. And that's pretty good right there. With my depth set, I'm going to find the approximate center, and I'm again going to make a cut, flip it, make another cut, and then I'm just going to extend this out a little bit as I go until the pipe fits in there perfectly. For the thickness of my pipe, it's 107 and 128 of an inch. I'm going to change this to a decimal place, and then I'm going to cut this in half. So right about there. So I'll go ahead and make a mark across here with it. Now I'll mark over 1/2 of an inch from the edge. Because I am really close to the edge, I'm going to skip the 5/16 that I normally would have used for my 1/4 inch threaded wood insert, and I've moved up to a 23/64. Before I seat my insert, I'm going to countersink this just a little bit because there's a neck on the top of it, and if I try to push down too far, it's going to split it. And there we go. Finally, I can section this off at 1 inches. I've made the first one, now I just need to make a second one. With these 2 pieces cut, we'll go ahead and cut 2 more pieces. For the friction brakes, I'm going to use some threaded brass bolts, and I'm just going to make them into Bittner nuts. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to press these 2 nuts together. We'll go ahead and do that over at the vise right now. We'll add a little red thread lock to lock it in place. In order for this stuff to cure, it needs about 24 hours for a permanent cure, but it should be ready in about, I don't know, 18 hours. We could probably use it and be okay. With all 4 pieces cut, I need to attach my pivot blocks. So what I'm going to do is add my bolts. If you bought a pipe that has a threading on the outside, you don't want to run your bolts against that. You want to go a little bit farther in, but I'm going to tighten this down enough that I know that this is going to be unable to move. And what I'm going to do is add some marks so that I know where this lines up later on. Now I can take this off, and I'm going to use some hot glue on those marks and then attach this. And of course, we're only going to do this long enough that we can add screws through the bottom. Now I can disconnect this and we can work on screwing these together. I've worked out where I want to put my screws. I'm just going to go in maybe about 3/4 of an inch from the back and the front. And I'm just going to use some 1 5/8 inch drywall screws to attach these. I place my cradle blocks right inside on the pipe, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill holes out in the pipe, through the pipe, into the wood. And I'll use a punch so that my drill bit doesn't wander. I'm using an 11/64 twist bit, which is just going to go down through the metal. Again, I'm going to use some drywall screws. I'll place this through the center and then make my mark. Now I need a cradle that will ride on the front of this that my stock will attach to. So what I need to do is measure the inside here, and it looks like 21 inches, or maybe even 21 1/16 of an inch. And I'll need to cut my block to about 2 3/8 of an inch. Now I need to cut this in half again, and my pieces need to be exactly the same width. So I'm cutting less than center, and then my second piece I'll run that through. I'll chamfer the inside corner so that I can add flat screws later on. I'll glue these back together with an 1/8 inch spacer, but because plywood is really very weak when you glue it on the sides, I'm going to go ahead and glue size it just a little bit. With glue sizing done, I can go ahead and add my spacer. On the inside of each of my cradle blocks, I've got some double-sided tape. My chamfer bit side now is going to fit over the top, so I want to make sure that this is centered on my blocks just right. And once I get it there, I'm going to press down, and now we're going to drill out the holes that will hold this on to those blocks. I've cut off another piece, and I'm just going to sit it over the top and just kind of get an idea of where those blocks are underneath. So now we need to drill this out at 1/4 inch with a taper on the top. We only need to go down the size of the bolt with this. Now I can pull this off. I'll place a mark here and here so I know how this goes back together later on. But I'm going to take this off, and I'm going to widen each of my holes using a 23/64 twist bit. Not a brad point bit. Twist bits are better at rounding holes, so make sure that you go with a twist bit, not a brad point bit. Now we just need to add the screws on the top. And there we go. We need to round the blocks on the bottom so this can pivot, but we are almost done. The jig itself is done, but it still needs a fence fixture that mounts to the router fence. The bit that you're going to need for this system is a 3.5 inch long flush trim router bit. You could get a long straight bit without a router bearing on top, but the bearing on this is extremely important. When we use it, it rides on the inside track of the fixture, and this track helps stabilize the bit. When you start pushing the wood into the cutter, the bearing keeps the bit from flexing or chattering around. In other words, it keeps everything running where it's supposed to. At my router table, this will fit over the bearing, and then my back will come on like this. This will attach to a track on the top, and then I lock it down. I need to make sure that this presses up inside that track so that when you go to move it, that it's a little tight and doesn't move a whole lot when you turn it. And now I can lock this down. Normally the reference on a router fence is just the fence itself, but because of the router bit sticking out, I needed to extend the reference so that my jig could run across it, while also leaving the bit exposed enough that I can make my passes. You'll want to make sure that when you add your reference that it's no thicker than 1/4 inch. As an example, I'm going to use a 3-inch wide strip of wood that's 3/4 inch thick. It's not very long, probably 8 inches, but with the setup I can probably go as far as 24 inches long altogether. To find the pivot point on my stock, I'll flip the board over so whatever the face that I don't want to be seen, and I'm going to mark the center. I find that using a marking gauge is really easy for this. I'll mark one side like that, then flip it around and mark the other direction, and then that gap in the middle, I can add a mark right through the center of it, and I'm ready to take this over to the drill press. I'll drill a tiny hole just big enough for a number 4 screw, and I'm using a screw that's about 1 inch long. Then I take my cradle, flip it over so that the valley side is up, and I just slide a screw through it and into the hole that I made. Then I'll add another screw to the other side. I've got my pivot right here. This attaches to the top using those 4 bolts. And then the entire thing fits inside of the sled. To use this, what I'll do is I'll swing my block down and I'll bump the bottom of my sled up to my reference point. I'll loosen the nut on the top part of my sled, and then I'm going to push it forward until my board hits that bearing. What I like to do is look on the side to make sure that I am vertical with my board so that I get right up to the edge. Or what you can do is take a 1/4 inch board, which is the distance that my router sticks out, and then place that in there. Once I get it locked in place, I'll turn the nut and lock it down. The process works like this. I'm going to bring this back and rotate it so that it's more horizontal, like this, right where the corner is going to hit my blade. Then I'll lock this in place and I'll make some cuts. Now what you'll notice is that my reference does not hit the bottom of my sled. I take very, very light passes until I'm close enough that it will hit that reference, and then I make one full pass all the way across. Oh, and it is a good idea to make sure you have dust collection. Now that this side is done, I'll take my pivot out and I'm just going to rotate it. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Now that doesn't actually look too bad, but we can come back with a sander and clean it up. If we look at the profile, you can see that it's very clean. There is a nuance that comes with the system. Because the jig is cutting part of a circle, the width of the board determines how much of that curve you actually see. If the board is really narrow, like around an inch, the router barely touches the surface and the curve is very subtle. As the board gets wider, more of that arc gets revealed. Around 3 inches wide, the curve will actually run all the way down to the bottom edges of the board. Now, if you want a bigger curve than that, this is where spacers come in. By adding a spacer between the cradle and the pivot, you move the board farther away from the cutter. That increases the radius of the arc and lets you cut wider boards. I've created a chart on my website that you can download showing the spacer sizes needed all the way up to 5 inches, which is about where this jig maxes out. And the spacer is just basically a piece of plywood that you'll slide between the cradle and the pivot. Keep in mind that you'll need to have different bolts to do this. Finally, if I were going to change anything about this jig, it would be moving the T-track that's in the middle over to the side and then adding a second T-track on the opposite side. The span of the board here is wide enough that you can get just a tiny bit of racking. Because of that, I'd also make sure that both edges are evenly spaced before locking this down. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. Do me a favor and thank my patrons down in the comments. They help keep the website running and make projects like this possible. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. And remember to keep making things.